What are the historical, political, ideological, and economic factors and actors that now define the dynamics and configuration of power in the world? And what is the U.S. position in what is known as the New World Order? That is a question that inaugurates this debate in 2011, March 7th, 2011, by Olavo de Carvalho and Aleksandr Dugin. This debate is rather long. It's a written debate, and there's a transcript of it. It's 167 pages, which I've printed out, and I wanted to go through some of the points here. So there's probably be a multiple video project of going through some of these points here. And I appreciate that this debate happened in 2011 because we can see some of the constellation or forces that were at play in the subsequent decade here in 2022. So this debate is it was happening on March 7th, 2011. Olavo de Carvalho is a president of the Inter-American Institute for Philosophy. I believe he died just recently in January 2022. He's a president of the Inter-American Institute for Philosophy, Government, and Social Thought. And Aleksandr Dugin, of course, is the leader of the International Eurasian Movement. They started a written debate on the topic, the USA and the New World Order. The debate ended on May 9th, 2011. Professor de Carvalho is a philosopher currently residing in the United States, or at least he was at that time, who has authored more than a dozen books and has been teaching an online philosophy course to more than 2,000 international students since 2008. His book, Aristotle in a New Perspective, 1996, has been acclaimed as a highly original contribution to the understanding of the Greek philosopher. Dugin is Vladimir Putin's geopolitical strategist, leading organizer of the Eurasian movement, and considered the most influential Russian thinker of the post-Soviet era. His book, The Foundations of Geopolitics, The Geopolitical Future of Russia, 1997, has had a large influence on Russian military and foreign policy elites and has been adopted as a textbook in the General Staff Academy of the Armed Forces of the Russian Federation. So the configuration of this debate is as follows. It is structured in 4 segments. The first segment deals with this question that we began this video with of the New World Order and the West's position in this order. So the first segment is de Carvalho's answer, and then Aleksandr Dugin's answer to that question. And that's what we're gonna probably just gonna get to Carvalho's answer to that question, and then another video get into Dugin's. The second segment is Aleksandr Dugin's reply, the West against the rest, and then de Carvalho's reply to him. A third segment is two more responses by each of the debaters, and the fourth segment is a closing remarks section. This is one of the most fascinating debates I've come across, and it kind of saddens me that I haven't seen anything like this coming, from the West or America as such. There seems to be an intellectual vacuum, at least in terms of the popular mindset of any of these deep philosophical and geopolitical considerations. So I'm going to read here again. I'll read the question that is being asked, and then we'll get right into Carvalho's response. I think from my preliminary reading, I think Carvalho lays a wonderfully poignant critique against Dugin's position, especially given what's happened the last decade in the United States. And I think that'll become clear as we get into Carvalho's response here. And the debate gets rather contentious later on. But this is, again, going to be Carvalho's first response to this question. Again, the question is, what are the historical, political, ideological, and economic factors and actors that now define the dynamics and configuration of power in the world? And what is the U.S. position in what is known the New World Order? So Carvalho's response. Words change their meaning, weight and value according to the situations of speech. Upon entering this debate, I must clarify from the outset that it is not a debate at all. The very idea of a debate presupposes both an opposite symmetry between the contending parties, from the point of view of their convictions, and some direct symmetry of their respective socio-professional statuses. Intellectuals discuss with intellectuals, politicians with politicians, professors with professors, preachers of religion with preachers of atheism and so forth. As for convictions, if we understand this term as only general statement about the structure of reality, mine do not differ from Professor Dugin's in many essential points. Does he believe in God? So do I. Does he think metaphysics of the absolute is possible? So do I. Does he wager that life has a meaning? So do I. Does he understand traditions, homeland, and family as the values that must be preserved above supposed economic and administrative conveniences? So do I. Does he see with horror the globalist projection of the Rockefellers and Soros? So do I. It is not possible to organize a debate between two people who are in agreement. On the other hand, from the standpoint of the actual positions we occupy in society, our differences are so numerous, so deep and irreducible that the very proposal of putting us face to face has a certain comic incongruity to it. I'm just a philosopher, a writer, a professor, committed to the search of what seems to be the truth and to educating these people, and educating a group of people who are so kind as to pay attention to what I say. Neither national nor international politics. We do not even have the ambition, much less an explicit project, for changing the course of history, whatever it may be. Our only hope is to know reality to the utmost degree of our power, and one day leave this life aware that we did not live in illusions and self-delusions, and that we did not let ourselves be misled and corrupted by the prince of this world and by the promises of the ideologues, his servants. In the current power hierarchy of my native country, my opinion is worthless, except maybe as a negative example and an incarnation of absolute evil, which is a source of great satisfaction to me. In the country where I live, the government considers me at worst an inoffensive eccentric. I think he's referencing Brazil here. No political party, mass movement, government institution, church, or religious sect considers me its mentor. So I can give my opinion as I wish and change my opinion as many times as it seems to be right, with no devastating practical consequences beyond the modest circle of my personal existence. Now, Professor Dugin, on the other hand, the son of a KGB officer and the political mentor of a man who is the very incarnation of the KGB, is the creator and guide of one of the most widest and most ambitious geopolitical plans of all time. A plan adopted and followed as closely as possible by a nation which has the largest army in the world, the most efficient and daring secret service, and a network of alliances that extends throughout 4 continents. To say that Professor Dugin is at the center and pinnacle of power is a simple matter of realism. To implement his plan, he has at his disposal Vladimir Putin's strong arm, the armies of Russia and China, and every terrorist organization of the Middle East. Not to mention practically every leftist, fascist, and neo-Nazi movement, which today operate under the banner of quote-unquote Eurasian Project. As for myself, I not only lack a plan for my own retirement, but my only available war resources are my dog, Big Mac, and an old hunting shotgun. And here's a picture here that Professor Carvalho provides with this juxtaposition. He continues, this tremendous existential difference, fully illustrated by the pictures, makes our opinions, even where their verbal expressions coincide to the letter, signify entirely different things in the framework of our perspective or our respective goals. The answers to the questions that inspire this debate will show us this, I hope, as clearly as do these photos. There are 2 questions. Who are the actors in the world scene, and what is the position of the United States in it? As for the first question, aside from the Catholic and Protestant Christianity, which I shall address later on, the historic forces that today contend for power in the world array themselves into 3 projects of global dominance, which I will tentatively call the Russian-Chinese, the Western, sometimes mistakenly called Anglo-American, and the Islamic projects. Each of these has a well-documented history, which shows their remote origins, the transformations they have gone through in the course of time, and the present state of their implementation. The agents that personify these projects today are as follows. 1. The ruling elite of Russia and China, and particularly the secret service of these 2 countries. 2. The Western financial elite, as represented particularly in Bilderberg Club, the Council of Foreign Relations, and the Trilateral Commission. And then 3, the Muslim Brotherhood, the religious leaders of several Islamic countries, and the governments of some Muslim countries. Of these 3 agents, only the first can be conceived of in strictly geopolitical terms, since its plans and actions correspond to a well-defined national and regional interests. The second, which is more advanced in the implementation of its plans for world government, places itself explicitly above any national interest. And I think this is the important point that has been proven more or less in the recent half a decade, actually. So the second, which is the more advanced in the implementation of its plans for world government, here he's talking about the Davos Trilateral Commission group, places itself explicitly above any national interests, including those of its countries of origin, which serve as its base of operations. That's key. And the third, conflicts of interest between national governments and the overarching goal of the universal caliphate are always ultimately resolved in favor of the latter, which, though currently existing only as an ideal, enjoys symbolic authority founded upon Quranic commandments that no Islamic government would dare to overtly challenge. Carvalho continues, the conceptions of global power that these 3 agents strive to implement are very different from one another because they owe to heterogeneous and sometimes incompatible inspirations. Therefore, they are not similar forces, or as it were, species of the same genus. They do not fight for the same goals, and when they occasionally resort to the same weapons, for example, economic warfare, they do so in different strategic contexts where employing such weapons does not necessarily serve the same objectives. Although nominally the relationships among them are competitive and antagonistic, sometimes even of a military nature, there are vast areas of fusion and collaboration, as flexible and changeable as they may be. This phenomenon disorients observers, producing all sorts of misguided and phantasmagorical interpretations, some in the form of quote-unquote conspiracy theories. Others as self-proclaimed realistic and scientific refutations of those theories. A good deal of nebulosity in the world scene is produced by a more or less constant fact. To wit, each of the 3 agents tends to construe in its own terms the plans and actions of the other 2, partly for deliberate propaganda purposes, partly due to a genuine misunderstanding of the situation. The strategic analyses by all involved, which reflect the ideological bias that is proper to it, even though they attempt to take into account the totality of available factors, the Russian-Chinese scheme stresses the geopolitical and military viewpoint, the Western scheme, the economic, and the Islamic scheme, the dispute among religions. So here we have these 3 categories, the military intelligence, the economic, and the religious. So you have, and Dugin will respond in this manner, you have the warrior, the merchant, and the preacher. This difference reflects in turn the sociological composition of the ruling classes in the respective geographical areas. 1. Stemming as it does from the communist nomenclatura, the Russian-Chinese ruling class is essentially made up of bureaucrats, intelligence service agencies, agents, and military officers. The preponderance of financiers and international bankers in the Western establishment is too well known to require further discussion. And 3, in the various countries of the Islamic complex, the authority of the ruler depends essentially on approval by the Ummah, the multitudinous community of authoritative interpreters of the traditional religion. Even though these countries show great variety in their domestic situations, it is not an exaggeration to describe the structure of their ruling power as, quote-unquote, theocratic. Thus, for the first time in the history of the world, the 3 essential modalities of power, political, military, economic, and religious, find themselves personified in distinct supranational blocks, each of them with its own plan for world dominance and its peculiar mode of action. This does not mean that they do not act on all fronts, but only that their respective historical views and strategies are ultimately delimited by the modality of the power they represent. It is not far-fetched to say that the world today is the object of a dispute among military, bankers, and preachers. Even though in current debates these three blocs are almost invariably designated by the names of nations, states, and governments to depict their interactions as a dispute among nations or national interests is a residual habit of the old geopolitics that does not help us in any way to understand the present situation. I could not agree with him more here. He continues, it is only in the Russian-Chinese case that the globalist project symmetrically corresponds to national interests, and that the principal agents are the respective states and governments. This is so far the simple reason that the communist regime ruling there for decades has dissolved or eliminated all other possible agents. The globalist elite of Russia and China is the government of these two countries. By contrast, the Western globalist elite does not represent any national interest and does not identify with any particular state or government, though it controls several of them. This is the main, again, another important point there. Again, by contrast, the Western globalist elite does not represent any national interest and does not identify with any particular state or government, though it controls several of them. On the contrary, when its interests collide with those of the nations where it originated, and this necessarily happens, it does not hesitate to turn against its own homeland, to subjugate it, and if necessary, to destroy it. I would argue that that is clearly evident with what's been happening in the United States in both the cities, the deterioration of the cities, the drug abuse, the open border, and then the castigating of the rural areas as deplorable people, and the continuous stoking of divisions, both organic and artificial, in order to create an untenable divide. That has been happening and has been intensified the last few years here. And just to be a little bit fair to Dugin, in an interview where I saw him talk, I believe was with Jack Murphy, he talked about how Dugin has changed his position on the American people as such, and kind of moved more closer to Carvalho's position here. Not exactly sure that it's that clear, but I'll try to find that conversation and maybe share that snippet here. Continues on, the Islamic globalists serve in principle the general interest of all Muslim states united in the grand project of a universal caliphate. Divergences arising from clashes of national interest, as for example between Iran and Saudi Arabia, have not proved sufficient to cause incurable injuries to the unity of the long-term Islamic project. The Muslim Brotherhood ringleader of the process is a transnational organization which governs some countries and in others is a political opposition party, but its influence is omnipresent in the Islamic world. The heterogeneity and asymmetry of the three blocks is reflected in the image that they have of each other, as manifest in their propaganda speeches, a system of errors suggesting that the fate of the world is in the hands of delirious madmen. 1. The Russian-Chinese perspective, expanded today in the form of Eurasianism, which will be one of the topics of this debate, describes the Western Bloc as A global expansion of American national power, B, the materialized expression of the quote-unquote open society liberal ideology, such as eminently proposed by Sir Karl Popper, and C, the living incarnation of the Enlightenment's materialist, scientistic, and rationalistic mentality, and therefore the enemy par excellence of all traditional spirituality. 2. Western globalism declares that it has no enemies other than quote-unquote terrorism, which it in no way identifies with the Islamic bloc, deeming quote-unquote fundamentalism a notion that indistinctly blends the ideological spokesman of Islamic terrorism and the quote-unquote Christian right, as if the latter were an ally of the former and not one of its main victims. I'd like to point out here, as an aside, that President Biden named public enemy number one domestic terrorists in the United States just this year. Put that in context when he says Western globalism declares that it has no enemies other than terrorism, which in no way identifies the Islamic bloc. So again, I think this point has been well proven here. This way, fear of Islamic terrorism is used as a pretext to justify the official boycott of the Christian religion in Europe and in the United States. Russia and China are never presented as possible aggressors, but as allies of the West. In the worst case, China is portrayed as a trade competitor. In short, the ideology of Western globalism speaks as if it already personified an established universal consensus opposed only by slightly insane, marginal, and religious groups. 3. The Islamic bloc describes its Western enemy in terms that only reveal its disposition to hate it per fas et per nafas, presenting it sometimes as the heir to the ancient crusaders and sometimes as the personification of modern materialism and hedonism. He's talking here about the perception of the West from the Islamic perspective. The generous collaboration of Russia and China with terrorist groups is clearly the reason why these two countries are absent from the Islamic ideological discourse. This way, irreconcilable and theoretical incompatibilities are circumvented. Some theoreticians of the Caliphate allege that socialism, once triumphant in the world, will need a soul, and Islam will provide it with one. Just as each of the three blocs cultivates a false image of its competitors, so does each also project a false image of itself. Leaving aside for now the Islamic and Western projective fantasies, let's address the Russian-Chinese ones. The Russian-Chinese bloc presents itself as an ally of the United States in the quote-unquote fight against terrorism, while at the same time providing weapons and all sorts of support to practically all terrorist organizations of the world and to the anti-American regimes of Iran, Venezuela, etc., and propagates the legend that the attack on the World Trade Center was the work of the American government. Russia complains that she was, quote-unquote, corrupted by Boris Yeltsin's liberal reforms and inspired by America, as if before them she lived in a temple of purity and not in the endless rot of the communist regime. It is worth recalling that the Soviet government lived essentially from theft and extortion for over 60 years without ever having to account for this. At the same time, it corrupted its population through the institutionalized habit of kickbacks, exchange of political favors, and influence peddling, without which the state machinery would simply grind to a halt. When its assets were distributed after the official dissolution of the regime, the beneficiaries were the members of the nomenclature themselves, who became billionaires overnight without severing the ties that joined them to the old state apparatus, particularly to the KGB. Quote, "There is no such thing as former KGB," confessed Vladimir Putin. Imagine what would have happened in Germany after World War II if the winners insisted of prosecuting and punishing the supporters of the old regime had awarded them access to the assets of the Nazi state. That is exactly what happened in Russia. As soon as the USSR was officially dissolved, its agents of influence in Europe and in the United States launched a successful operation to block any investigation of Soviet crimes. Nobody was ever punished for the murder of at least tens of millions of civilians and for the creation of the most efficient machinery of state terror known to mankind. On the contrary, the chaos and corruption that followed the dismantling of the Soviet state were not caused by the new system of free enterprise, but by the fact that the first to benefit from it were the masters of the old regime, a horde of thieves and murderers such as never before seen in a civilized country. It's a pretty brutal critique here. What's more, while whining about being corrupted by American capitalism, Russia forgets that it was she who corrupted it. Since the 1930s, Stalin's government, aware that the strength of America resided in, quote, its patriotism, its morality, and its spiritual life, unleashed a gigantic operation, in the words of its main perpetrator, Willy Musenberg, designed to, quote, make the West so corrupt it stinks. The purchase of consciences, the involvement of high-level officers in espionage and shady businesses, the intense propaganda campaigns to debilitate the moral belief of the population, and the generalized infiltration of the educational system wound up producing results, particularly after the 1960s, radically modifying American society to the point of rendering it unrecognizable. It was also the Soviet action that gave planetary dimensions to drug trafficking in the 1950s. Its history is well documented in Red Cocaine, The Drugging of America and the West by Joseph D. Douglas. When Russia wails that after the fall of communism she was invaded by the drug culture, she is simply harvesting what she sowed. think even now with infiltration of the fentanyl trade in the United States, in the hundreds of thousands, up to 100,000 that are dying from overdoses per year. I think this is I think it's a right critique here. Nothing of this vast corrupting action is a thing of the past. Nowadays, there are more Russian agents in the United States than during the Cold War. China, well fed by American investments, shows evidence that the apparent liberalization of its economy was only a cover up for consolidating the totalitarian regime, making it increasingly solid and seemingly indestructible. As for the position of the United States in the world scene, let us first look at how Professor Dugin describes it and then see how it is in reality. According to the Eurasian doctrine, the United States are the incarnation par excellence of liberal globalism. The face of liberalism that Professor Dugin sees in America is essentially that of the open society advocated by Karl Popper. This is how Professor Dugin summarizes the liberal idea, and this is a rather long block quote. To understand the philosophical consistency of the National Bolshevik ideology, it is absolutely necessary to read the fundamental book of Karl Popper, The Open Society and Its Enemies. Popper developed a fundamental typology for our subject. According to him, the history of humanity and the history of ideas divide themselves into unequal halves. On the one hand, there are the partisans of the open society, which represents, in his view, the form of normal existence of rational individuals, so are for him all men, who base their conduct upon reasoning and the supposedly free personal will. The sum of such individuals must logically form the quote-unquote open society, essentially non-totalitarian, since it lacks the unifying idea or value system of a collectivist nature, be it supra-individual or non-individual. The open society is open precisely because it ignores all teleologies, all absolutes, all established typological differences. Therefore, it ignores all limits that emanate from the non-individual and non-rational domain, supra-rational, irrational, or irrational, the latter being the more frequent term in Popper. On the other hand, there is the ideological camp of the enemies of the open society, where Popper includes Heraclitus, Plato, Aristotle, the medieval schoolmen, as well as the German philosophy of Hegel, Fichte, and above all Hegel and Marx. Karl Popper points the essential unity of their approaches and discerns the structure of their common Weltanschauung, whose characteristic traits are the denial of the intrinsic value of the individual, whence stems the loathe for autonomous rationalism and the tendency to submission of the individual and his reason to the non-individual and non-rational values, which always had fatally, according to Popper, leads to the apology of dictatorship and political totalitarianism. National Bolsheviks accept absolutely and without reservations Popper's dualist view and are totally in agreement with his classification. However, in contrast, they consider themselves to be the resolute enemies of the open society and their philosophical foundations, that is, the primacy of the individual, the value of rational reasoning, the progressive social liberalism, egalitarian, atomic, numeric democracy, free criticism, and the Cartesian, Kantian Weltanschauung. Continuing with the quote in reference to globalism here, it says, he's quoting Dugin. Nowadays, it is evident that the world state conceived as a world market is not a distant or chimerical perspective, because that liberal doctrine, Karl Popper's, is little by little becoming the governing idea of our civilization. And this presupposes the final destruction of nations as vestiges of a bygone era as the last hurdle to their irresistible expansion of globalization. The globalist doctrine is the perfect and finished expression of the open society model. That is a close quote. Carvalho continues, therefore, liberal globalism is the project in progress that aims to establish throughout the world the Popperian model of the open society, necessarily destroying on its way national sovereignties and every metaphysical or moral principle that aspires to be superior to individual rationality. It is the end of nations and of all traditional spirituality, the former being replaced by a global scientific, technocratic administration, and the latter by a mix of scientism, materialism, and relativistic subjectivism that inspires the globalist elite of the West. Since the United States is the main rant focus of this project, and Russia its main focus of resistance, for motives we shall see later, the clash is inevitable. And another quote here, the main thesis of the Neo-Eurasianism is that the struggle between Russia and the United States is inevitable, since the United States is the engine of globalization, seeking to destroy Russia, the fortress of spirituality and tradition. Close quote. Carvalho continues, I made a point of quoting my opponent's opinion in some detail because, though I do not consider it to be false with respect to the mentality of globalist elites, which are really inspired by Popperian ideas, I can prove with a narrow margin of error that 1. The description cannot in any way be applied to the United States, a nation where Popperianism is a recent implant, which has no local roots, is totally hostile to American traditions. 2. The United States are not the command center of the globalist project, but on the contrary, its prime victim, marked for death. 3. The globalist elite is not an enemy of Russia, China, or the Islamic countries potentially associated with the Eurasian project, but rather it is their collaborator and accomplice in the effort to destroy the sovereignty, the political military power, and the economy of the United States. Remember, he was writing, this was in 2011. 4. Far from favoring free enterprise capitalism, the globalist project has supported statist and controlling policies everywhere, and in this it does not differ from the interventionism advocated by the Eurasianists. Globalism is only, quote-unquote, liberal in the local sense that the term has in the United States as a synonym for leftist. The globalist project is a direct heir to the perpetuator of Fabian socialism, a traditional ally of the communists. Popperian ideology itself is not liberal capitalist in the sense of classical liberalism, but above all else a, quote, test and evaluate approach to social engineering. Right on, obviously, in 2022. 5. Eurasianism opposed the Popperian open society as an abstract ideological model. However, as Eurasianism is not only an abstract ideological model but a geopolitical strategy, it is obvious that it fires at the Popperian ideology to reach beyond it a specific national power, that of the United States, which has nothing to do with the Popperian ideology and can only expect evil from it. Even worse, American nationalism is a powerful Christian resistance to the globalist ambitions, which have been trying to take over the country in order to destroy it as an autonomous power and use it as a tool for their essential anti-national plans. The destruction of American power will remove the last reasonable hurdle to the establishment of a world government. Then all that will be left is the sharing of the spoils among the three globalist schemes, the Western, the Russian Chinese, and the Islamic one. Finally, 6, Russia is not at all the quote-unquote fortress of spirituality and tradition, appointed by a celestial mandate to castigate the flesh of the United States for the sins of the immoral and immaterialist West. Today, as in Stalin's time, Russia is in a den of corruption and wickedness such as never before seen, dedicated to the spreading of its mistakes around the world, as announced in the prophecy of Fatima. It should be noted that this prophecy never referred particularly to communism, but to, quote, the errors of Russia in a generic way, and it announced that the dissemination of these errors, with all its ensuing retinue of disgrace and suffering, would only cease if the Pope and all Catholic bishops of the world would perform the rite of consecration of Russia. Since this rite has never been performed, there is no reason not to see in the Eurasian project a second wave and an upgrade of the, quote, errors of Russia, the announcement of a catastrophic and incalculable proportions. 7. If Russia today, through the medium of Professor Dugin, presents to the world as the bearer of a great redeeming spiritual message, we need only recall that she has done so twice before. A. In the 19th century, all the thinkers of the Slavophile stripe, as Dostoevsky, Soloviev, and Leontiev, saw the West as the source of all evils and announced that in the following century, Russia would teach the world, quote-unquote, true Christianity. What happened was that all this spiritual arrogance was impotent to stop the advance of communist materialism in Russia herself. B. Russian communism promised to bring to the world an era of peace, prosperity, and freedom beyond the most beautiful dreams of previous generations. All it managed to do was to create a totalitarian inferno of which neither Attila nor Genghis Khan could have glimpsed in a nightmare. It would be wonderful if each country learned how to exorcise its own evils before pretending to be the savior of humanity. Aleksandr Dugin's Russia seems to have taken the opposite lesson from her crimes and failures. So there you have it. That is Carvalho's response to the question asked at the beginning. And next time we'll get into Dugin's response to the question as well. So let me know what you guys think of the critique there and just the overall gist of this argument by De Carvalho. So thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time.